The small house on the outskirts of Cleveland was clean, but the air inside was heavy with things left unsaid. A pot roast, slow-cooked for hours, filled the rooms with a warm, comforting aroma that fought a losing battle against the chilling silence at the dinner table. Helen had set the table with care, using the good plates, but her daughter, Jennifer, and son-in-law, Mark, ate with a detached coldness, as if they were guests at a budget hotel. They occupied the space her love had curated, their faces tight with a resentment that seemed to have become their permanent expression. An embroidered dish towel, a gift from a friend years ago, hung by the sink, its cheerful "Home Sweet Home" stitching a painful irony. Helen watched them from her side of the table, a ghost in her own life, her presence tolerated but never truly welcomed. The fragile peace was shattered when Mark set his fork down with a sharp clatter against his plate. The complaint started small, a grumble about the rising cost of electricity, but it was a thinly veiled attack. His words, though directed at his wife, were arrows meant for Helen. She instinctively tried to make herself smaller in her chair, her shoulders hunching forward as if to shield herself from the impact. She stared at her hands, resting in her lap. Their calloused skin, a map of a life spent scrubbing floors and sewing clothes to give her daughter a better future. Jennifer, instead of deflecting the blow, caught the arrow and turned it on her mother. Her voice, once a source of joy for Helen, now dripped with accusation, listing every penny spent, every inconvenience endured, turning Helen's very existence into a financial liability. Jennifer's anger, stoked by Mark's silent, smug approval, finally erupted into a firestorm of cruelty. She pushed her chair back so violently it screeched across the linoleum, the sound ripping through the tense quiet. "You're just dead weight, Mom!" she yelled, her voice raw with a bitterness that had clearly festered for years. The words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous, striking Helen with the force of a physical blow. Then, with a trembling finger, Jennifer pointed towards the front door, her face a mask of cold fury. "That's it! Get your things and leave!" she screamed, the command echoing off the worn walls. "We don't want you here anymore." It was a final, brutal severance, the sound of a daughter disowning her mother, shattering the last fragments of the world Helen had so carefully built around her. The ensuing silence was broken by the heart-wrenching sob of a small child, 7-year-old Leo, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes, launched himself from his chair and ran to his grandmother, his little arms wrapped around her waist in a desperate, clinging hug as he buried his face in the soft fabric of her apron, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Helen, numb with shock, could not cry. She looked from the stranger her daughter had become to the innocent boy who was her only source of light. As she slowly rose to obey, the image of Leo's tear-streaked face, his eyes pleading with her not to go, was the last thing she took with her. A pain that deep, that unjust, is something you never forget. If you believe stories of quiet strength deserve to be heard, I truly hope you'll subscribe to follow this journey. The cold of the metal bench at the bus stop seeped through Helen's thin coat, a chilling contrast to the fiery humiliation still burning in her chest. The street was quiet, bathed in the indifferent orange glow of a single street lamp that seemed to highlight her isolation. Her world had shrunk to this small patch of concrete, a single worn suitcase at her feet containing the meager possessions she was allowed to grab. She felt less like a person and more like a piece of furniture that had been discarded on the curb. Its usefulness expired. The silence was absolute, a hollow space where the sounds of a family dinner had been just an hour before. She was 65 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was utterly and completely alone, cast out into the Cleveland night. Her mind, seeking refuge from the present, drifted back decades. She saw a much younger version of herself, hunched over a sewing machine in the dead of night, the gentle hum a lullaby in the small apartment. Her fingers, though tired, moved with a practiced grace as she put the finishing touches on a pale blue prom dress for a 16-year-old Jennifer. She remembered the sheer joy on her daughter's face when she saw it, how she'd spun around in the living room, the fabric flaring out like a flower in bloom. Helen had worked 3 extra cleaning shifts to afford that satin fabric, and she had considered every lost hour of sleep a worthy investment in that single, radiant smile. It was a memory so pure, it now felt like a betrayal. Another image surfaced, this one less joyful but just as defining. She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the marble floor of a sprawling house in Shaker Heights. The scent of bleach was sharp in her nostrils, a smell she would forever associate with earning a living. That week, Jennifer needed new textbooks for a college course, an expense that was impossible on her regular salary. So, Helen swallowed her pride and took on more work, her body aching with a fatigue that settled deep in her bones. She remembered the quiet dignity she felt when she handed the crisp bills to her daughter, never mentioning the back pain or the chapped skin on her hands. It was simply what a mother did. Her sacrifice was silent, an invisible foundation upon which Jennifer's life was built. Back in the biting cold of the present, her hand instinctively went to her purse, a simple, worn leather bag she'd had for years. Her numb fingers traced the familiar contours until they found a small, hard lump sewn discreetly into the fabric of the lining. It was a secret she had kept for over 45 years, a private rebellion against the fear of ever being helpless. This wasn't just a purse, it was a vault. It held the sum of all her extra shifts, all the small tips she'd tucked away, every dollar she had managed to save by mending her own clothes and eating simple meals. It was her final defense against the world's indifference, a shield she had painstakingly constructed, $1 at a time. The idea for the secret fund had been born from grief and terror. The day after her husband's funeral, the weight of her new reality had nearly crushed her. She was a widow with a young daughter and almost no money to her name. The fear of becoming a burden, of failing Jennifer, was a physical sickness. That week, she took her first side job cleaning a neighbor's garage, and the $20 she earned felt like a lifeline. She didn't spend it. Instead, she sealed it in an envelope, which she then sewed into the lining of her purse. It was the first deposit into an account of self-reliance, a promise to herself that she would always find a way to stand on her own 2 feet. The raw, tear-streaked face of her grandson, Leo, flashed in her mind, eclipsing everything else. She could feel the ghost of his small arms wrapped tightly around her waist, his body shaking with sobs. He hadn't seen her as dead weight or a financial liability. He had seen her as his grandmother, his refuge, the person who read him stories and mended his favorite stuffed bear. His desperate cry, "Don't go, Grandma," echoed in her soul, a sound of pure, unconditional love. That love was now the only anchor she had in a world that had been torn from its moorings. It was for him, she realized, that she could not allow herself to break. His belief in her was a debt she had to honor. A profound shift occurred within her, deep and quiet as a river changing its course. The crushing weight of sorrow began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This was not the time for tears. This was the time for action. The money she had saved wasn't just an emergency fund. It was the physical manifestation of her life's labor, of every sacrifice she had ever made. It was the price of her dignity, painstakingly collected over decades. Jennifer had accused her of being worthless, but Helen knew, with a certainty that settled in her very bones, that she held her own value in her hands. She would not use it to simply survive, she would use it to build. With trembling fingers, she unlatched the old brass clasp on her purse. The familiar scent of worn leather and mints filled the air. She found a loose thread in the lining and pulled, carefully unpicking the stitches she herself had sewn so many years ago. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with rubber bands, were several dense bundles of cash. She had never counted it all at once, but she knew the approximate sum, $130,000. It felt impossibly heavy, the concentrated mass of a lifetime of quiet perseverance. Looking at it, she didn't feel rich, she felt armed. She finally had the resources to match her resilience. But a lifetime of putting others first was a difficult habit to unlearn. A nagging voice of guilt whispered in her ear. Was this money truly hers to use? She had always imagined it as a final gift, something to leave behind for Jennifer and Leo, a last act of maternal care. To spend it on herself felt like a profound act of selfishness, a betrayal of the very role she had played her entire adult life. She wrestled with the ingrained belief that her needs were secondary, that her purpose was to serve, not to thrive. The thought of building a life solely for herself was both terrifying and exhilarating, a foreign concept she had never dared to entertain. She looked down the empty street, and the fear of dying alone, estranged from her family, was a tangible threat. Her greatest terror was not poverty, but the thought of never seeing Leo's bright, curious eyes again, of never hearing his laughter fill a room. Using this money to establish her own independence might create a permanent rift, a canyon too wide to ever cross. Yet the alternative was to fade away, to prove her daughter right by becoming the helpless victim Jennifer had declared her to be. What lesson would that teach her grandson? She had to show him that strength wasn't about enduring cruelty, but about having the courage to build a new life away from it. The decision settled not with a crash, but with a quiet click, like a lock finding its key. She would not be a victim. She would be a founder. The money would be the foundation for a new home, a place of peace and respect, a sanctuary built not of brick and mortar, but of self-worth. It would be a place where her skills were not taken for granted, but celebrated, a place where she could create and contribute on her own terms. It's so easy to feel broken when the people you love hurt you, but seeing a person find their strength again, it gives you hope. If these stories of resilience move you, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep sharing them. Helen pushed herself up from the bench, her aching joints protesting but obeying. The suitcase felt lighter in her hand. The bus stop was no longer a symbol of abandonment, but a point of departure. She straightened her back, pulling her coat tighter around her, a small act of defiance against the cold and her circumstances. She didn't have a map for the road ahead, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt she was holding the compass. Her first destination was simple, a small, clean motel room for the night, a place where she could be safe, warm, and finally begin to draw the blueprints for her new life. 6 months had passed. The crisp autumn air of Cleveland carried the scent of change. Jennifer found her mother not in a shelter or a charity home, but in a small, bustling storefront with the name Golden Threads painted in elegant script on the window. Inside, the gentle hum of sewing machines filled a space bright with bolts of colorful fabric and the quiet camaraderie of several other women, all near Helen's age, working with focused contentment. Helen stood at a large cutting table, a measuring tape draped around her neck, her face illuminated by a newfound serenity. She looked up as the bell on the door chimed, her eyes meeting Jennifer's. There was no flicker of surprise or anger, only a placid calm that was more unsettling to Jennifer than any accusation would have been. She was no longer facing a victim. She was facing a founder. Jennifer, looking thin and frayed at the edges, stumbled forward. The carefully rehearsed words she had practiced dissolved into a raw, desperate plea. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke of Mark losing his job, of the mounting debts, and the eviction notice that felt like a death sentence. She begged for forgiveness, her voice cracking as she recounted the cruelty of that night, but her apology was inextricably tangled with a desperate appeal for money. She needed help. A loan. Anything to stop them from losing the house. She was appealing to the mother she had always known, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her, expecting that bottomless well of maternal duty to still be there for her to draw from, even after she had so carelessly poisoned it with her own ingratitude. Helen listened without interruption, her hands resting flat on the wooden cutting table, grounding her. When Jennifer's sobs subsided into ragged breaths, Helen finally spoke, her voice even and clear, carrying across the low hum of the machines. The money I had, Jennifer, was the value of my work, of my dignity. It was the price of every floor I scrubbed and every seam I sewed so that you could have a better life. It held a value you never saw. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the space between them. I will not give you what you so easily threw away. But I can give you this. She gestured to an empty sewing machine in the corner. I can give you a station and teach you how to use it. The rest you will have to earn, just as I did. The offer hung in the air, a lifeline so different from the one Jennifer had expected. It wasn't a handout, it was a tool. It wasn't forgiveness, it was a path. For a long moment, Jennifer simply stared, her mind unable to process a world where her mother's help came with conditions rooted in self-respect. The familiar dynamic of sacrificial mother and entitled daughter had been irrevocably shattered. There was no anger in Helen's eyes, only a profound and unshakable boundary. Helen then glanced at the clock on the wall, a small, gentle smile touching her lips. I need to finish this order now, she said softly. Leo is coming for the weekend, and I promised him we would make a quilt together. The mention of her grandson was not a weapon, but a simple statement of her new priorities. Jennifer eventually left, the bell on the door sounding a quiet, final note on that chapter of their lives. Helen did not watch her go. She turned her attention back to the fabric under her hands. The smooth, cool cotton a comfort. A deep sense of peace settled over her, a quiet resolution that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with closure. She looked around at the community she had built, a sanctuary of purpose and mutual respect. She had not only saved herself, but had created a space where others could find their own value. Seeing a life rebuilt not on bitterness but on dignity is a powerful testament to the human spirit. If you believe these stories of strength are worth telling, your subscription truly helps us continue to share them with the world. The months that followed saw Golden Threads blossom into something more than a business. It became a cooperative, a bustling hub of activity where the gentle hum of sewing machines was a constant, comforting soundtrack. Helen had transformed her personal sanctuary into a community lifeline, providing employment and a profound sense of purpose to other women of her generation, women who, like her, had been made to feel invisible. She was no longer just surviving. She was the architect of a thriving enterprise built on mutual respect and shared skill. Her small storefront became a landmark of resilience in the neighborhood, a testament to the idea that a life's worth of experience was an asset, not a liability. She moved with a quiet confidence, her hands, once symbols of thankless labor, now the instruments of creation and empowerment for many. True to her word, Helen gave Jennifer a place at a sewing machine. The first few weeks were a study in humility. Jennifer, whose hands were accustomed to a keyboard and a smartphone, struggled with the needle and thread, her frustration often bringing her to the brink of tears. Yet she persisted, driven by a desperation she had never known. She learned to measure fabric, to cut a straight line, to stitch a durable seam. She worked alongside the other women, listening to their stories and slowly earning her keep, one small project at a time. It was not forgiveness her mother had given her, but something far more valuable, a chance to build her own worth from scratch. to understand the profound dignity that comes from creating something with your own two hands. Helen's new house, though modest, was a universe away from the one she had been cast out of. It was filled with light, the scent of fresh linen, and the constant, cheerful presence of her grandson. Every weekend, Leo would arrive, his backpack full of school projects and his eyes shining with excitement. They would spend hours in the small garden she'd planted or at the large kitchen table, working on the quilt she had promised him. Each patch they sewed together was a story, a memory, a piece of their new life being stitched into a beautiful whole. Here, in this space built on love and self-respect, Helen was not a burden, but the cherished center of a small, happy world. She was finally, truly home. Years later, Golden Threads was a cornerstone of the local economy, a symbol of second chances. Helen, now a beloved community leader, watched as a teenage Leo helped a new employee organize bolts of fabric, his movements easy and confident. Jennifer, having built a modest but stable life for herself, arrived to pick him up, a quiet respect having replaced the entitlement in her eyes. She often thanked her mother for the hardest and most important lesson of her life. Helen would simply smile, her heart at peace. She had learned that self-love was not selfish, and that real family was a fabric woven from threads of mutual respect. To witness a life so completely and beautifully rebuilt reminds us that our value is not for others to decide. If you believe in the power of these quiet victories, subscribing helps ensure these stories continue to be told.